The history of heavy.
Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the History of Heavy podcast. This is a show, this is the log line, Dave. This is a show where we will trace the chronology of heavy music across genres, song by song. I am your host, Michael Huntsman, and I am joined by my co-host, Big Daddy Dave Lieberman. Dave, we are finally here. How are you? Are you ready to kick this thing off?
I am so ready to kick this thing off, Mike. I want to thank you for coming up with this idea. This is something that this is a topic we've been talking about for over 30 years, anecdotally and just for fun. And now we're going to do it anecdotally for fun in front of an audience.
That's right. Anecdotally started at our humble beginnings at San Francisco State University. Very late nights on copious amounts of a variety of things, listening to the likes of Black Sabbath and Rush and Led Zeppelin and Public Enemy and NWA and a lot of things we will be talking about on this show. The format of this show is effectively, as I mentioned at the top, a timeline essentially of songs that trace what Dave and I consider to be quote unquote heavy music. We are beginning tonight with Link Wray, which we will talk about in depth in a moment. And it goes all the way up into present day. We have a playlist on Spotify. The link for that is below. That is essentially an outline of every episode we will do. That playlist is very dynamically changing. In fact, I added a Girls Against Boys song to that playlist today, because I heard a Girls Against Boys song while I was working out. I'm like, oh my God, Superfire has to be on this playlist. So it is ever evolving, but we are very excited about it. We expect episodes to come out weekly. The origins of this podcast really began, 30 years ago, but in terms of kind of the idea of chronicling kind of quote unquote heavy, really began with two books I read over the course of about the last year and a half, give or take. The first one is called Electric Wizards, a Tapestry of Heavy Music, 1968 to present day. That book was written by a guy named J.R. Moores. And the other book is called Monolithic Undertow, In Search of Sonic Oblivion. And that book was written by Harry Sword. Both of those books came out in 2021, and both kind of very different approaches. Electric Wizards is very much all about heavy guitar music, hard rock, acid rock, heavy metal, death metal, black metal, drone. And then the Harry Sword book is more kind of about kind of the drone, talks a lot about Indian music and Ravi Shankar specifically. It talks about the Tibetan monks chanting. And it talks a lot about ambient music, the likes of Brian Eno and Cluster and Terry Reid and those kinds of folks. It gets into a lot of krautrock, Faust and Neu and Can and all that stuff. We're going to touch on some of those things. We get into some jazz, we get into some hip hop, we get into some funk, a lot of different things. This is not exclusive to guitar music, but where we decided, as this is our podcast, to begin this timeline is 1958. And this year was chosen kind of for a very specific reason, but really for a very specific song. But to set the stage for why 1958, why this time, as with every episode, we're going to go to Dave's Cultural Corner. And we're going to kind of set the scene for what was going on in the world and in the culture that kind of birthed tonight's song, Link Wray's Rumble. So Dave, take it away.
So we're going to begin in 1958 with Link Wray's Rumble. And in the late 50s, we see a clash between the conservative values of the post-war era and the growing influence of youth culture. And we're going to talk in our conversation about the teenager and how there's a few important ways that ties in. The war in Vietnam had begun in 1955, but it wouldn't escalate into the national consciousness or result in protests for another 6 or 7 years, but it's bubbling in the background. Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, and America was in the middle of a recession and unemployment was soaring. This gave way to a burgeoning counterculture that was pissed off and ready to get noisy. In the other world, the rest of the world of media, Gigi dominated the Academy Awards, winning 9 Oscars, breaking the previous record of 8 set by Gone with the Wind and tied by From Here to Eternity and On the Waterfront. Rock and roll was still in its infancy, with Bill Haley and the Comets' hit Rock Around the Clock having been a smash in 1954. And at this time in 1958, Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry had become the biggest superstars of the scene. Volare by Domenico Modugno, which was, that was the top song in 1958. And I think listeners are probably more familiar with Dean Martin's version, but it was an Italian artist and it was an international hit in Italian. Elvis Presley had 3 songs on the year-end top 50, which was the most of any artist in 1958. But at the dawn of the 1960s, things are about to get heavier.
They are indeed. They are indeed. Before we get to those 60s, though, I'm going to take you to 1929. And that is the year that Link Wray was born. He was born in Dunn, North Carolina. That's Dunn with 2 N's. He began playing guitar as a very young boy and formed his first band as a teenager with his brothers. He wrote Rumble in early 1958, and the band began playing that song at gigs where a local DJ heard it and ultimately helped release it as Link Wray's first ever single. It would also be his kind of only big single and the thing he would be recognized for the rest of his career. The song sounded unlike anything else on radio, and it became an instant hit. It's one of the earliest examples of guitar tremolo and also guitar distortion, which was not kind of an everyday thing and not something you heard commonly on radio. The distortion then was not via a pedal that you bought at Guitar Center, but kind of happened upon by Link Wray poking a hole in his amplifier speakers with a pencil. And the producer of Rumble thought that it was a mistake, but Wray insisted that it be kept. Also notably and extremely important to why this is the first song we're talking about, because Link Wray is oft credited as being the inventor of the power chord. That is effectively playing 2 notes most often, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, depending on how adventurous the guitar player wants to get. But the power chord is effectively the most simple way you can play guitar. If you've ever played Smoke on the Water or played Iron Man on more than one string, you are playing a power chord, and it basically became the foundation for all heavy guitar music to come. So when you think about the Ramones, when you think about Motorhead, when you think again about Black Sabbath, most of what they are playing are power chords. So we can all thank Link Wray for that. The rawness of Rumble civilized the shift that Dave just talked about, that sort of increasingly restless youth culture that was beginning to bubble up, and sort of signified an evolution of music that a lot of the artists, Jerry Lee Lewis and Bill Haley and Elvis and a lot of the folks that Dave mentioned, certainly Little Richard, it was a vehicle for self-expression and defiance, sort of a rebellion against the everyday. Rumble is, again, a very specific ground zero, a very specific patient zero. And here are some notables referencing the song that I think further validates this as our starting point. Bob Dylan called it the best instrumental ever written. Jimmy Page said that Rumble was the first song he ever heard that had that much attitude to it. Iggy Pop said that he left school emotionally the first time he heard the song. And of course, the song, for certainly us and younger generations, know the song even if they don't know the song, primarily through movies and TV, notably, of course, Pulp Fiction, The Sopranos, SpongeBob SquarePants, Independence Day, on and on and on. This song has become ubiquitous in a lot of ways. And I think the ubiquity of Rumble is more about the coolness that the song just sounds capital C kind of Fonzie cool. But I think also that there is a heaviness, and I want to get into that tonight, obviously. Dave, I know you were a little maybe surprised that Rumble was kind of the first song I recommended. Do you find this song to be heavy, and is this the right place for us to have started?
Interesting question. I'm glad we're starting with this question because my first thought was, this doesn't sound heavy to me. And as we were talking about it and listening to it, and as I was researching it, I recognized what we're doing here on this project is talking about an evolution of heaviness in music. And I had to remember that I'm here in 2024, at the end of 2024, where we have a different definition of heavy today than at the beginning of this spectrum. It's similar to watching a movie with old effects. It's hard to watch some old movies that were favorite because the effects are just analog, when we're used to being assaulted by this digital flash and fast edits and everything that have become the way movies are visually. And similarly, heaviness has become, it had arrived 30 years ago and just become more and more and more and more refined. But this as a starting point is really interesting because we're beginning that spectrum. And so it has some evolution to do, but as I started thinking about it, my first reaction was, this doesn't sound heavy. It's in fact sounds really mellow to me. But that's because I have a context that is so much older than where this song was. This song came at a point in time that was revolutionary for where it was. And I appreciate that we're starting here for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is a significant arbitrary place to start. You can choose many different starting points for this conversation. This is where our conversation starts, so I appreciate that. But the way that it is informing our discussion is going to lead our discussion in and out of different genres. This isn't a history of heavy metal. Right. This is a history of heaviness, and that can come in lots of different genres. One of the things I observed is the creepiness. And you said the C with a cool with a capital C. I would say creepy with a capital C. There's a sinister appeal here. There's a creepiness here that it's slithering. And that is a huge part of what heavy is to us, is a slow, sludgy, heavy ambiance. And so this is a perfect point of departure for this discussion, for our podcast and for our spectrum of conversation. And I think it frames up our playlist very nicely.
Yeah, very well said. I think there's a few things about it. I think one is when we're talking about heavy, we are primarily talking about sonically heavy, but not exclusively. Heavy will mean a variety of things as we get into some later songs where maybe they don't sound as sonically heavy, but there's a heaviness or a weightiness to them that is undeniable. Funkadelic is kind of one of the things that immediately comes to mind. We're going to talk about Maggot Brain. You could argue that song isn't necessarily sonically heavy, but that song is fucking heavy. And we'll get to that when we get to that. There's a weight to it. we won't talk a lot about a lot of punk rock. Punk rock, which we both love, is a lot thinner sounding and a generally speedy, which heavy is not usually speedy. I think the tempo of the song that you mentioned is really important here. You know, the surf music that is about to emerge shortly after, right around the same time that Rumble comes out with the Ventures and Dick Dale and kind of the Surfaris and all of those bands. You know, they played instrumental music too, generally much speedier. You know, the song Wipeout by the Surfaris would come out just 3 years or 4 years after Rumble. And that, you know, that song is really kind of energetic and poppy and upbeat and not heavy. Great song, not heavy. The plotting of Rumble has a lot more to do with what Black Sabbath would do than it does with what Minor Threat or the Ramones would do. So that's the kind of the spectrum or the area that we are talking about. And I have to imagine that hearing Rumble in 1958, again, to kind of to try to be in the mindset of the kids that were hearing it at the time, they weren't probably using the word heavy, although maybe they were, because certainly the beatniks to come were using that word to mean a variety of things. But I can't imagine how noisy and kind of intense Rumble must have sounded to a 14, 15, 16-year-old kid in 1958.
Yeah, one of the things that I observed is, due to that case, music up until this point was for dancing. And so it had a rhythm and a beat that was danceable. And it was, to your point, usually more uplifting, and chord progressions were in a major scale, and it was much more approachable. And of course, we can go back to different genres and times. There's some blues that's kind of heavy, but it's not, we don't connect with it as much, you and I. Classical music, you know, there's Wagner and Rachmaninoff and Chopin. That stuff's dark and heavy, but it's also real busy. There's other stuff that's more spaced out, but it doesn't have the beat of the drum. And adding the beat of the drum makes an important contribution to the pace of the song. And when you're listening to this song in 1958, you can't dance to this. How do you dance to this? Right. You know what you do to this? You strut. You like, your lip sneers, and you just like bob your head a little bit. In fact, I came across a video of Link Wray performing this song in 1974, Winterland, San Francisco. So if you know, you can just look that up on YouTube and find it. And I don't know anything about this guy. I didn't look at his bio and find out if he was a nice person or not. But he looks like an asshole. He looks like a wife-beating drunkard who would be friends with Doyle from Sling Blade. This does not look like he's doing dumb. He's got a little sneer on his face. He's looking at the audience like, fuck yeah. Yeah, you know it. Fuck yeah. And he's just doing his thing. That is attitude. That is sonic attitude. Yeah. And while punk rock has a lot of attitude, it's not sonic attitude. It's lyrical attitude. It's high energy attitude. It's cultural attitude. It's stream of consciousness attitude. It's not sonic attitude, I wouldn't say, especially not compared to this song. So I wanted to bring that into the conversation because that is part of our definition of heavy and part of the starting point of this spectrum of our conversation and why we're starting here.
Yeah, our drugs of choice to complement these songs that we will be talking about are weed and lewds, not speed and uppers, right? These aren't coke fueled songs. You know, you brought up the blues, and you could make a very compelling argument that we should have started these conversations with Robert Johnson in the late 30s. Robert Johnson certainly, by any definition of heavy, could be included in the conversation. I think the important sonic distinction, to get back to the actual sound, is the distortion, is the tempo, is the attitude. And that's going to be the focus. Let me ask you this about Rumble, Dave. Do you love this song?
Good question. I am. I'll put it this way. This is a old friend. This is a dear friend. I know this song well now, and I never heard it until Pulp Fiction. And since then, I heard it a million billion times because the Pulp Fiction soundtrack was just on in the background of my life for years. No matter where I went, it was just on. And I had become very close with it and very familiar with it that way. Do I love it? I wouldn't put it in those terms. I would say this is a good friend and an old friend.
Yeah, it's interesting. Pulp Fiction came out 36 years after Rumble was released. And probably different, but I don't think it has any less punch. I don't think the impact of the song is any less. I talked about Wipeout, the Ventures. I mean, if we get into Mogwai or Godspeed You Black Emperor, I love instrumental music, instrumental guitar music. This song is kind of a granddaddy to all of that music, all those bands. So I like the way you said that. It is kind of a lifelong companion song to me. That's kind of some of these songs, like this song, like the songs we'll talk about in episodes really 2, 3, 4, and 5, are all sort of ubiquitous. I'll use that word again. They're songs that, like of course you like them, but I don't know that anybody can love them anymore because they're kind of comfort blankets. We will get into
sonic comfort food.
Yeah. Like of course I love Rumble, but we don't often think about Rumble, right? Which is why it's fun to get into conversations like these. There are songs where we will get into artists. Motorhead as an example, where we will not talk about Ace of Spades, which would be kind of the obvious Motorhead song to talk about, just because we want to talk about something different. But for some artists, obviously like Link Wray and who we'll talk about in episode 2, the Kingsmen, it's the only choice. Link Wray is Rumble. Rumble is Link Wray. That's who he is. So when you talk about seeing that live performance, him embodying effectively the song, it's like, well, that makes perfect sense because Rumble is who Link Wray was. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. I wanted to bring another part of our earlier discussion about teenagers back into the conversation. Please. One of the things that's going on in the background here is the hot rod culture. And we're in California, and the hot rod culture comes out of California. Biker culture comes out of California. This is a time when a couple things are coalescing in that Kustom culture. And there was a book I read years ago called Kustom Kulture with 2 Ks, K Kustom, K Kulture, that talks about this trilogy of figures. Von Dutch, who is, we know the Von Dutch brand now, but Von Dutch was a real person, a racist and a neo-Nazi, a total asshole. But he brought pinstriping to the hot rod community and elevated pinstriping to an art. Ed Big Daddy Roth, who did all these crazy custom cars and is responsible for the Rat Fink character and this monster association with hot rods. And Robert Williams, who was an artist, a paint artist, who captured a lot of the phenomenon of the hot rod culture in art. That is all happening right now. And after World War II, service members come back from Europe. They've seen combat. They've seen the world. They get home and they're restless. and they're buying motorcycles and they're getting out there and getting rowdy, and bikers are showing up. Outlaw bikers become a thing after this in late 40s and into the 50s. And this is a really important backdrop because part of motorcycle and hot rod culture is customization. It's a key linchpin of that culture. Taking something that you inherit from your grandparents or your parents, you get the 32 Ford Coupe out of your granddad's barn, that rusty old thing, you cut it down, you customize it, you hop it up, and now you're out there doing, you're cruising, right? What was the George Lucas's movie?
American Graffiti.
Thank you. Now you're doing American Graffiti. This is the time when you had mentioned before in a conversation, teenager wasn't a term before this. And in recalling talking to my dad, who was born in 1945, he grew up in this moment. He was wearing suits as a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old. It was a formality. Kids didn't really have the same kind of connection to childhood. There wasn't a kidhood and a teenagehood. Kids were just future adults. And so you stuffed them into adult roles. Things like Leave It to Beaver and The Little Rascals. We would see kids acting through adult scenarios with adult perspectives. And it was clear that adults wrote these things, but this is what was portrayed. Now, of course, it's a stylized Hollywood portrayal of a thing, but that's good enough for this conversation to make my point, which is that this is an era where teenagers become and influence a market, a zeitgeist, a tour de force. And this song sounds like adolescence. This song sounds like I'm gonna make my mark with this. My parents had guitars, I'm gonna have distortion. My parents had dance music, I'm slowing it down. And this is a point in time where there's a pivot.
Really well said. I mean, one of the key tenets of teenagers is that they're pissed off, right? And these teenagers in 1958 had good reason to be pissed off. You talked a bit about the recession and kind of the state of the U.S. economy. Geography becomes really important, not just for Rumble, but for every song we're going to talk about. You know, you talked about California and U.S. in general at this time birthed Rumble, but whether we're talking about Birmingham, England, or Compton, California, or the Lower East Side of Manhattan, these locations and what is happening in these locations while these people are making this pissed off, heavy music, it's happening for a reason. And Link Wray was sort of the pissed off side of that, where Bill Haley was kind of the fun, jubilant, and you know, those are two different kinds of teenagers, right? That's why some kids were listening to the Bay City Rollers, and other kids were listening to Black Sabbath. You know, that sort of, those two sides of the coin kind of go on for generations. And we're going to be talking about the certainly the Sabbath side of said coin. Well, I think we did it, Dave. Anything else about Link Wray or Rumble or the late 50s that you want to get in before we wrap up episode 1?
I would just point out that one other song that sort of straddles the line might be Miserloo by Dick Dale, where it has that kind of eerie sort of sound. And even, he does a cover of Hava Nagila, which has that sonic, that scale that is a little more exotic. Maybe it's a Eastern scale, but it's more upbeat than we would put in this particular conversation. And so I did want to mention that because that also exists on the Pulp Fiction soundtrack. and it doesn't have the sludgy, slow quality. It's too energetic.
Yeah, Miserloo is an interesting one. Another great song, another great instrumental. The song would come out 4 years after Rumble, but notably, you know, that song was actually originated as a Middle Eastern folk song from the late 30s. So Dick Dale's version, and every version after, including Agent Orange's great version from like 1982. But I do think it's relevant that Agent Orange did that song, because Miserloo to me is more the punk side of the instrumentals of this day, while Rumble is more the metal, I guess, for lack of a better definition right now. But if Miserloo is punk, then Rumble is metal.
That's yeah, well said.
Yeah. All right, man, we did it. I'm really proud of us. We actually did it twice, but we're not going to get into that. We will be back next time with episode 2, when we will be talking about Loué by the Kingsmen, which will be a lot of fun. Thanks, Dave. That was
we gotta go, man.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, this is a good time. Thanks again for putting this together. Can't wait to bring it on home, have these conversations.
Thanks, guys. Keep it heavy.
Okay, thank you. Bye.